Mission Control, this is Arthur. I don't even know what day it is anymore. Do you read me? Over.
Nothing, only the hiss of static. He waited a few seconds before ending the transmission. It was more of a habit than a hope. He couldn't remember when he'd last received a response. Maybe it had been weeks, maybe months. Maybe there had never been anyone on the other end. He'd stopped trusting his memory.
Well, whatever. Screw the protocol. I just needed to talk to someone. Even if there's no one listening on the other side, I prefer to think there is. That even if they can't answer, someone is listening to my voice. I'm still alive. I'm still here. And that's it. That's all. I just want to say that I'm here. I exist. And damn, what silly whims one can have in a situation like this, but I'd kill for a damn ice-cold Coke. I hope everything's all right over there. See you tomorrow. Arthur out.
Trying. At first, the silence of space had seemed like a gift. There were no engines, no wind, no distant voices, no constant murmur of a world determined to make itself known. Only a calm so absolute he could almost feel it resting on his shoulders. It gave him peace to think that out there the universe didn't need to say anything. Now that same calm seemed unnatural. He left the control room and slowly crossed the observation module. At the far end, the metal shutter protected the viewing platform when the radiation was too intense. He pressed the switch, and the mechanism began to raise it with a low hum, the only living sound in the entire station. The glass revealed the emptiness. Arthur remained motionless. The universe seemed to swallow everything with its vast immensity, perhaps literally. Either he was going crazy, or there were fewer stars. He was sure it wasn't his imagination. He had been contemplating that same landscape for too long to be mistaken. He knew constellations he could no longer find. Spaces where dozens of luminous points had once shone now appeared completely black. Each day, one more disappeared. They didn't explode. They didn't slowly fade. They simply ceased to be there, as if someone were erasing them from the sky one by one. He looked away for a moment. When he looked again, the emptiness seemed even greater than it had been just seconds before. The changes began so subtly that Arthur began to convince himself they were simply a product of exhaustion. He imagined things because of the prolonged isolation, and his mind tried to create distractions. But then he began to perceive changes inside the space station. He noticed it first in the control room. There were fewer switches. Not that they were broken. They were simply gone. Then one of the secondary displays in the control room disappeared. It wasn't broken. It was simply no longer there. In its place was a continuous sheet of the same gray metal that covered the rest of the panel. Smooth, seamless, without screws, without the slightest sign that it had ever occupied that space. 2 days later, a row of indicator lights was missing. Then several more switches disappeared. He consulted the technical manual again and again, searching for some explanation. The diagram still showed controls that the console no longer had. He restarted the system. He ran the diagnostic protocols. He even disassembled part of the panel, convinced he would find some electrical fault or a hidden compartment. He found nothing. It was as if the station had decided to rewrite its own history. A week later, as he headed to the communications module to make his routine attempt to contact Earth, he didn't reach it. The corridor ended several meters before where he remembered. He stood motionless, observing the wall that now closed off the corridor. It was built with the same material as the rest of the station, with no visible welds or color differences. It wasn't a makeshift repair. It seemed to have been there since day one. Wait. What must be on the other side? He couldn't remember clearly. What was he going to do? He felt his mind go numb. A hatch? Another room? Perhaps a storage area? He was sure there was something important there before. The certainty remained. The memory, however, did not. That day he discovered the hole. It was next to the bed where he slept, where until yesterday there had only been a metal floor. It was small, barely a few centimeters in diameter, a circle of almost mathematical perfection. It didn't look like a perforation. The metal wasn't deformed around it. There were no sharp edges, burrs, or signs of impact. The ground simply ceased to exist at that point, as if someone had erased a portion of matter with absolute precision. He knelt and held up a flashlight. The beam of light illuminated the outline of the circle for an instant. Then it was gone. It didn't fade into darkness. It didn't reveal a bottom. The light simply ceased to be. Arthur dropped a screw into that tiny chasm. He waited for the sound of the impact. He waited for a bounce. He waited for anything that would allow him to imagine depth. But nothing happened. The screw disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. For several minutes he remained motionless, observing that impossible circle. He had dedicated years to understanding how the universe behaved. He knew how metal reacted to a fracture, how a shock wave propagated, how gravity responded in orbit. This didn't obey any law he knew. The hole continued to grow, not abruptly, nor capriciously. Each morning it was barely a few centimeters wider than the day before, just enough for Arthur to doubt himself before accepting the evidence. The absence continued to expand. He stopped trying to understand it. He simply observed it, like someone contemplating the slow and inevitable advance of a tide. As the days passed, the circle reached the size of a table, then the size of the bed. He ended up getting used to waking up with that emptiness just inches from his feet, a darkness so absolute it seemed to devour even the silence. It was then that he saw the other figure. It happened at the observation deck. He had raised the metal blind to check if any stars were still visible. The glass reflected the image of a thin, exhausted man with a long beard and a wrinkled uniform. For a second he thought it was his own reflection, until it blinked. He didn't. Arthur remained motionless, petrified. So did the reflection. There was something subtly different about it. It wasn't the face, nor the posture. It was about the facial expression, as if weariness had been replaced by a disquieting, almost complacent serenity. Then it looked up. It wasn't looking at the glass. It was looking at him. And it smiled. It wasn't a broad smile, just a slight curve at the corners of its lips, enough to chill him to the bone. Arthur jumped back. When he looked again, there was only his reflection. He never managed to convince himself that it had actually happened. But from that day on, he stopped going near any surface where he might see his reflection. The hole kept growing. The station kept shrinking. Each day, another room disappeared. The blueprints lost all meaning. Corridors he knew by heart ended at bare walls. Entire compartments had vanished without a trace, as if they had never been part of the structure. The last lights began to go out shortly after. First, the power in the science module disappeared. Then, the lighting in the main corridor. Finally, only the emergency beacons remained, projecting a faint, intermittent red glow that barely managed to discern shapes in the darkness. The station breathed in shadows. Arthur took a flashlight and went out in search of the source of the malfunction. He knew he wouldn't find anything. Even so, he needed to do something. He needed to convince himself that there were still problems that could be fixed. He moved down the corridor, guided by the emergency lights. The silence was absolute, so absolute that he could hear his own heartbeat. As he turned a corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. It was impossible, but someone was there, standing, waiting for him. It was himself, the same height, the same uniform, the same face, But where Arthur could barely hold his gaze, this other version remained completely still, observing him with unbearable calm. The doppelganger was smiling, as if he had always known that this encounter would happen. Arthur started running. He didn't look back. The corridors seemed different, narrower, shorter. The red lights flickered less and less brightly, leaving long intervals of total darkness. When he reached the cabin, he slammed the door shut and engaged the manual lock. Only then did he dare to breathe. A moment later, he heard the first knock, sharp, metallic, another, and another one. The door vibrated on its hinges. They weren't angry knocks. They were patient, constant knocks, as if whoever was on the other side knew that, sooner or later, he would end up coming in. Arthur backed away until he felt the edge of the hole beneath his heels. It already took up more than half the room. There was hardly any floor left. He stared into the infinite darkness of the inexplicable hole. The knocking continued on the other side of the hatch, and then he understood everything. No more running. He closed his eyes. He breathed slowly and deeply, and took a step toward the hole. There was no fall, no sensation of plummeting. There simply ceased to be any direction. There was no up. There was no down. Fear lingered with him for a few moments, clinging to his chest like a wounded animal. Then he began to unravel. First, the urgency vanished, then the trembling, then all the memories. Everything that had weighed on him for so long began to detach with unexpected gentleness. The darkness wasn't cold. It wasn't hostile. It enveloped him with the same tenderness with which the sea holds someone who stops fighting the waves. Arthur stopped wondering where he was. He stopped wondering how much time had passed. He even stopped wondering who he was. For the first time in his memory, he felt no fear, only an immense peace, a silent peace, as if the universe itself had finally asked him to rest. The monitor's beeping became continuous. No one spoke for a few seconds. The doctor observed the motionless line on the screen, lowered his head, and noted the time of death. Then he covered the body with the sheet up to the shoulders.